2013 was a pretty standard year for the first-person genre, filled with walking simulators, run-of-the-mill cookie-cutter sequels in established franchises, and a handful of genuinely original and enjoyable new titles. So I've decided to take a look at the first-person games released over the last 12 months, in what could be referred to as a retrospective. I've expanded this video to the first-person genre in general, as opposed to shooters primarily. I'd also like to point out, as much as I'd like to be able to play every single game that comes out each year, that's simply not going to happen. So don't get upset if your favourite game doesn't get mentioned, it's just that I probably didn't have the chance to pick it up.
You two, front and center.
Now the first big FPS release for the year also happened to be one of the worst. That game was Aliens Colonial Marines. I'd been keeping my eye on this game since it was originally planned to be developed for PlayStation 2, so when I finally heard that Gearbox had taken over the project, I assumed that it could only be a good thing. I mean, they did a good enough job with Borderlands, right? Well, holy shit was I wrong. Colonial Marines was a buggy, rushed game with horrible enemy AI, subpar visuals, and the typical rehashed story involving Weyland-Yutani and the expected and utterly phoned-in performance by Lance Henriksen.
We're here because we responded to your distress call.
Despite being laden with fan service, this game was a huge letdown and didn't really get the year off to a good start.
This was meant to be our Normandy, but alas, here we are in hiding. We nibble here, we nibble there, but we can't turn the tide, we can't build momentum. We need a game changer.
That month we also got Crysis III, running on the brand spanking new Crytek 3 engine. Now, I've always had a love-hate affair with the Crysis series. I love the open-ended gameplay and the often photorealistic visuals and smorgasbord of graphical effects. But then I also hate the PC optimization and the fact that they're always full of bugs and glitches. Crysis 3 doesn't really improve anything wrong with the other games and is nothing more than a new campaign with a few new weapons, environments, and a slightly updated graphics engine. But in all honesty, that's not really a bad thing. When it's played on the highest difficulty, which it really should be, it is a satisfyingly hard game, where you're forced to use every one of your suit's powers or else you'll be gunned down in a heartbeat. It's gritty, dark, loud, violent, impactful, cinematic, and explosive. And it's damn good fun. Is it Game of the Year? Fuck no, but it does offer a good 6 or 7 hours of enjoyable gameplay as you kill all manner of aliens and humans across a plethora of gorgeous and intricately designed environments.
I baptize you in the name of our prophet, in the name of our founders, and the name of our Lord.
In March, we got the big one, BioShock Infinite, the supposed last game in the series and one that seemed to divide a lot of fans over how the story was all wrapped up. It's the kind of ending that leaves you scratching your head as you realise how none of it makes any goddamn sense.
Give me back my daughter! No!
Despite the horrible plot decisions, BioShock Infinite was a largely enjoyable game with an incredible art style and really fun, intense combat. Looking back on my video review for this game, I can't help but wish I had been a little more ruthless on certain aspects, but for the most part I really liked it. I even finished it on the 1999 difficulty mode and have the soundtrack in my iTunes library. May saw the release of Blood Dragon, Metro Last Light, Sanctum 2 and Call of Juarez Gunslinger. These are all 4 vastly different games. Blood Dragon in particular ended up being one of the most enjoyable gaming experiences I've had in recent years. You play as a super cyborg soldier in a dystopic future, voiced by the awesome Michael Bain.
Mark 4 style, motherfucker!
As you blast your way through a campaign littered with 80s pop culture references. Despite being little more than a Far Cry 3 reskin, it managed to feel original and fresh and was so self-aware that you couldn't help but enjoy yourself.
Just let me kill people, damn it.
Metro Last Light is the sequel to Metro 2033, following on from the original game's so-called bad ending. It is for the most part identical to Metro 2033 in almost every single conceivable way, though there seems to be much more of an emphasis on scripted sequences this time around, mostly fast-paced chases through the tunnels, explosive gunfights against waves of enemies, and tedious, unskippable sections of exposition where you walk around listening to characters spouting off dialogue for 5 to 10 minute stretches, which kinda sucks. Also, for a game that tries to encourage conservation with ammo and supplies, I find it funny that some moron thought it would be a good idea to throw you into lots of situations where you're up against dozens of mutants and enemy soldiers, having to waste copious amounts of ammunition killing them. To me, that's kind of the whole fucking antithesis of what the entire game is supposed to be about. And don't even get me started on the goddamn boss fights. Now, this might be fine for the lower difficulties, but what made Metro 2033 so great was its brutally hardcore Ranger difficulty modes. In Ranger mode, it felt like the way the game was meant to be played. You had to be very smart with ammunition, and you took a lot more damage from enemies, forcing you to avoid most encounters if possible. But with all these forced combat areas in Last Light, it just makes this playstyle kind of impossible. The difficulty mode feels like a lazy afterthought thrown into a campaign which just flat out doesn't support that kind of approach. At the end of the day though, I still kind of enjoyed it. Shooting feels a lot more refined, it looks just as amazing as the first game with some brilliant physics and particles. Also, sneaking around slitting the throats of neo-Nazis and communists never gets old. Sanctum 2 is a cool little tower defense styled game played from a first-person perspective, where you defend your base from waves of aliens. This game is cheap in price, surprisingly easy to pick up, and extremely addictive. Good fun. Lastly, sneaking in at the end of May was a fun little shooter named Call of Juarez Gunslinger. Finally, a half-decent game in the series with a unique arcade feel, ultimately ruined by what may be the most horrible fucking duel system I've ever seen in a Western. Whoever designed this minigame deserves to have their legs chopped off because it ruins what is otherwise a fun and exhilarating shooter. But considering that Gunslinger was released for a mere $15, this is still a good deal. It didn't reinvent the wheel, but what it does was functional and it looks and sounds great. I can think of a lot more worse ways to spend $15. Late July saw the release of Devolver Digital's Rise of the Triad, a remake of a bad 90s game with the same name. Let down by some shoddy performance issues and a horrible checkpoint system, it was still a great throwback to the shooting games of an era long since past. A couple months later, a team called Flying Wildhog also took a spin on an old classic, rebooting the Shadow Warrior franchise. Now, I had mixed feelings about this game. I'm a huge fan of the original, and I'd always hoped that they could have kept the feeling and tone of the original in this reboot, especially considering how they marketed the hell out of it as being old school. You got the power! However, this was really not the case. A lot of people kind of misconstrued my video review for this because I was overly critical of how it had been handled, but I really do think this is a legitimately fun game, with great dismemberment and a gorgeous graphics engine. But it ain't old school, not by a long shot. What it is though is one of the most enjoyable games of 2013, and something every FPS fan should play, right now. The end of 2013 was rounded up with some multiplayer-based shooters, Payday II, Call of Duty Ghosts, and Battlefield 4. I'm not going to say too much about the latest Battlefield and Call of Duty games, as most people know what to expect with those anyway, and they are for the most part utterly forgettable. Payday 2, however, is a little bit different. It's the sequel to Payday the Heist and tries to improve and expand upon the first game once again, offering a series of missions revolving around heists in places like jewelry stores, art galleries, and banks, combining hard-hitting sound effects, sharp visuals, and a thumping soundtrack. Payday 2 was enjoyable for about 10 or so hours until the game devolved into a grind fest, where you would end up replaying short missions over and over to farm for equipment. But if you've ever wanted to feel like you're acting a scene out of a Michael Mann film, then this is the game for you. You also don't need to spend upwards of 100 hours on the multiplayer mode to see progress either, compared to the COD or Battlefield games.
When Stanley came to a set of 2 open doors, he entered the door on his left.
Finally, I'd like to talk about 2 games that seem to have garnered the most attention this year from critics, and these are Gone Home and The Stanley Parable. Gone Home is a thinly veiled patriarchal walking simulator that starts off with a promisingly eerie opening, but soon turns into an exposition-heavy lesbian love story that will take you the better part of 60 minutes to complete.
It's like, after graduation, I'm just never going to see you again?
The Stanley Parable is another dialogue-heavy walking fest with multiple pathways, storylines, and endings that occur depending on the player's actions.
Stanley took the first open door on his left.
Now look, I get the appeal of games like this, I really do.
Stanley walked through the red door.
And I can imagine this would be great fun for people who don't want any actual gameplay and just want to sit back for an hour drowned in facetious writing, social commentary, and satire, combined with so-called open-ended gaming, which is still highly linear and devoid of real choice. Look, that's fine and dandy. They are both very unique, creative, and for the most part, intelligently written. But they are largely nothing more than interactive movies, and the mere fact that they've been included in all of these Game of the Year lists, and even won in some instances, is pure poppycock. Are they worth paying full price for? No fucking way.
Stanley decided that this machinery would never again exert its terrible power over another human life.
Lastly, I'm going to fire out a few sentences or two on the games not worthy of a full paragraph. Slender the Arrival. Oblivious teenage girl walks through a forest at night, hunted by a 7-foot-tall, low-polygon monster that kills her with its evil staring powers. Dead Island Riptide, second game in the series, following on in the prequel's tradition of sloppy story, bad voice acting,
Get up, you son of a bitch. Whoa, I owe you something too.
Glitchy combat with poor hit detection, and an FOV that gives me a chronic migraine. Day 1, Gary's Incident. Clever concept let down by boring combat, bad animation, inconsistent visuals, and needlessly confusing controls.
Uh-oh.
And finally, Outlast. Blatant poo-to-pie bait in the guise of a highly scripted ride through an abandoned asylum, full of jump scares and too spooky for me imagery. In case you couldn't tell by my tone of voice, it's really not worth playing any of those games. Looking forward to 2014, things are looking pretty dismal for the first-person genre. On a positive note, id Software is supposed to be working on a new Doom game, but ever since Carmackers left the team to go play with VR headsets and toy rockets, that could really go either way. Thief 4 is going to be out in February and may not be as horrible as it previously looked, largely because Eidos Montreal seem to have actually listened to fans and done away with the XP system. Alien Isolation is going to take another stab at the Aliens franchise after Gearbox Software royally fucked things up. A new Wolfenstein game is due out as well, a franchise I've got a serious soft spot for. Whatever the case may be, I'm going to do my best to get my hands on as many of these games as I can and review them the way I always have. It's funny to think that barely 12 months ago I had 50-something subscribers, and now a mere year later I've got over 1,600 people who like listening to the sound of my stupid voice. It's been cool chatting to some of you on Steam and hearing your feedback about my videos, so for that I say thanks and wish all you guys a Merry Christmas, New Year's and all that shit. See you in 2014.
Sayonara, sushi! Yeehaw!